What's going on, y'all? KMBest here, your favorite 16th ranked Marvel Snapper, a rank that would make Drake proud. Let's talk about the best decks in Marvel Snap. Our starting point here is the nexus of Annihilus and Cannonball Profex. This is a deck that is using Mobius in order to combat Loki, and then also, for the sake of Pixie, allowing it to be a powerful lockdown control deck with Cannonball, Professor X, Annihilus, and Sentry, while also leveraging occasional discounts and free wins. Typically, fusing a good, solid, consistent game plan with one that can create high cube games is a great place to start in any metagame, and this deck does that with aplomb. One of the things that makes this deck a little bit different in terms of my build is the inclusion of Mysterio and Mockingbird. You do not need those cards to play this deck. You can very easily replace them with Iceman and Red Hulk, or whatever you really want as another big guy and another small guy. I found that Mysterio Mockingbird was a little bit more useful for me on a little bit more of a consistent basis, but Iceman Red Hulk, Spider-Ham Red Hulk, Spider-Ham Magneto, all that stuff is totally fine. That is more window dressing than anything else. What you're really looking to get at here is a good curve that also gets extremely upgraded when you play the card Pixie. You are able to use Pixie to juice games where your opponent has no real understanding of how wide your range can be. You can do things like Final Turn Sentry Annihilus, or Final Turn Cannonball plus a big guy. That kind of stuff is absolutely phenomenal, and being able to just free roll those unexpected wins thanks to Pixie is a great thing to do. Next up, I think it would be a failure on my part to not discuss Loki at the very least, although I think fears of this deck taking over the metagame were slightly overrated. It is still an excellent choice if you choose to make it. Now, many people will ask, do I need Valentina to play Loki? Do I need Red Guardian to play Loki? My answer is no, you do not need either of those cards to play Loki. You can do a whole bunch of different stuff in those spots. Do not feel as though you need to spend 12,000 tokens on these cards. Do not feel as though you need to open for Valentina. I personally have those cards in there because I think they are probably the best option, but there is really not a lot of daylight between, say, Mobius and Red Guardian, or between Valentina and Cball or Mirage. There is just simply not enough daylight, and the supporting package in Loki is extremely strong on its own. The major strength of this deck has absolutely been on display, as Loki-less Loki decks, like we'll get to later, have been really, really good for me and several others in the top 20. And that is a unique situation for a deck to be in, because this deck actually, compared to the Loki-less Loki decks, you could argue is a little bit behind. If you want to make it more modern, one suggestion I would have, maybe you start thinking about cutting Shang-Chi, and maybe you start thinking about cutting Mockingbird. These are the big, clunky, non-agile cards in the deck, and I think that there is something to be said for making the deck smaller and more modern, especially as so many decks are going away from being Shang-Chi-able. However, I have this build as just a safe default option that anyone can just pick up and be absolutely happy with. I think there is nothing wrong with playing this, but you might want to try to make it sleeker, smaller, and a little more modern, because you're not going to beat the combo decks with this anyway. So let's talk about Noki. This has been an incredibly successful deck for me. It's what I pushed from rank 26 to 16 with over the course of a few days. This is a great deck, and I am consistently surprised by the fact that it's a great deck, because really what this is leveraging is the combination of Angela, US Agent, and the Collector to carry it on points, and then cards like Snow Guard and Mobius and Luke Cage in order to just sort of edge out small wins. This is a deck that is effectively playing small ball. It wants to be a fairly close game most of the time. You're not going to get any big wins with this. You're not going to have a ton of easy snaps. You're going to have to eke out small advantages and snowball them into further small advantages, using the advantages given to you by the game, like locations, and by your own cards, like Angela, Elsa, and the Collector. Your synergy is powerful, but a lot of what you're doing is randomly generating something powerful with Valentina or Agent Coulson, and then using that as a supplement to what you're already doing. To that end, Quinjet is an excellent card in this deck. being able to go Quinjet Valentina into just playing the 6-drop you get is phenomenal, because a lot of people are playing Mobius, and that means that 6-drop won't be playable later. This came up a lot when I was playing the deck. In the same vein, having multiple scalers is excellent. Other good openers like Angela, Kitty, and a Collector. You're scaling the Angela, you're scaling the Collector at the same time. Things like that are obviously very good. You're very good at using Agent Coulson Quinjet because you are able to weave that stuff into your curve very easily. And I think overall, I would describe this as it's a deck for, I would say, probably more advanced players. There's a lot less free wins in here and a lot more, oh, I have to go back and make sure I made the right play there, because there probably was a way to win it, I just didn't get to it. Another thing that this deck is leveraging is US Agent, who is quite strong. I do think people are going to watch this and say, oh, what do I do if I don't have US Agent? Well, the thing is, if you don't have US Agent, you can play Loki. Very simple, very easy to replacement to make. You can simply take US Agent out and you can put Loki in, and I don't even know, the deck might get better for all I know. US Agent is a card you are almost never playing before turn 6, and that means it is mostly incompatible with the Loki game plan, so you can very easily swap US Agent out for Loki and have a game plan that is much smaller and sleeker, and that is sort of what the modernized Loki that is not sort of built to be a generically useful thing might end up looking like. The ongoing Spectrum deck has been performing extremely well. I can't say I have the world's largest amount of problems with it. However, its numbers are good enough and I see it enough, and it is strong enough that I feel confident including it on this tier list. This deck is effectively looking to leverage Jean Grey in concert with several tech cards to have a good matchup against a wide variety of decks. Something like Jean Grey and Cosmo can be very good against decks leveraging Annihilus or decks leveraging Hela. That combination is extremely powerful. By a similar token, being able to make them play into a lane that you are likely to win thanks to Mojo and the Spectrum buff is also quite powerful. This is a deck that is actually kind of a Jean Grey deck, and that buff actually really did matter. There are a couple of flex slots in here. I'm not convinced Omega Red is required. I'm not convinced that Man-Thing is required, but I will say the other thing this deck is leveraging very powerfully is using Jean Grey to get US Agent into being one of the biggest possible cards. Something like Jean Grey US Agent Mojo is probably going to win you that Jean Grey lane, and then you just need to figure out another lane to win. The one change we've really made here is the inclusion of Mobius over Punisher from the original list. That is a concession to Loki, just straight up. If you don't have a Mobius, this deck kind of gets run over by the card Loki, and you very much are not in the business of enjoying getting run over by the card Loki. So yeah, Mobius is in there. Possibly the single most underrated deck in the entire game, the Thor deck is excellently positioned to combat a metagame full of Professor X and Loki. Because it had enough spots to put Mobius in there, and because so much of the payoff for this deck is cards that you have to shuffle into your deck and then draw out later, Loki is genuinely not very good into what this deck is doing. One of the major downsides, however, is giving your opponent a Quake, even if it costs the normal amount, is just a really huge pain in the ass in terms of how you play the game. It sucks. It is not fun to play against Quake. By the same token, you are actually running Quake, and that means that when you play a deck like this, you need to be aggressively snapping your Quakes because nobody plays around that card. This card is an absolute nightmare. Being able, when it is good, it is winning you 8 cubes, straight up, as long as you are snapping the correct way when you have the card. It's not always good, but when it's not always good, that's also fine. The best way to understand the Thors deck right now is it is a Sarah-style control deck that has eschewed the Sarah package because the Sarah package itself is not all that useful. One other thing you can look to include in this list is either removing the Shadow King for the Loki matchup or including Luke Cage instead of Killmonger. That Killmonger slot could also be something like Ghost. There's a lot of tech you can try in there. Fundamentally, the major flex spots are the current Killmonger slot and the current Mobius slot. You can also mess around with the Lizard slot. There has been Maximus in there. There has been White Widow in there. Those are the cards I would start with customizing. I do believe that the vast majority of the rest of this is unfortunately irreplaceable, including Lady Deathstrike, who is kind of the only way you don't get completely hosed by people playing Annihilus against you. Hela has tried to adapt to an adventurous metagame by including Sandman, and I think that's actually like a pretty good thing to do, because it gives them something to do on the turn 5s where they have already ramped and they don't want to play a 6-drop because it'll probably get Shang-Chi'd, so there's no real upside to doing that kind of stuff. And Sandman can actually win games that this deck otherwise could not, and I think that that makes it a worthy inclusion. The real flex spot here is, do you want to play Giganto or do you want to play Black Knight? I consider that a little bit of a wash, and since I consider it a little bit of a wash, I have decided we're going to put the card that's in Series 3 in the deck because I don't even really have a coherent argument that Black Knight is all that much better. I really am not convinced by that right now. However, it does give you some more, like, you know, I played Black Knight into Corvus, into Ebony Blade, into Sandman, into Big Guy. You can win games like that a little bit more with Black Knight, but they're so uncommon in my experience that it's just like, I'd rather just have the extra consistency on the Hela, which is what the deck is built to do. You may make a different choice. I think that is perfectly okay. Phoenix Force remains a reasonable choice if you want to play combo decks. I tend to think it's as well positioned as a combo deck can be, which is to say not very well positioned, but it's not, I think it's a little bit less well positioned relative to Hela than it was last week, because I think Hela is a little bit more consistent, and if people are playing Loki and Noki and things of that nature, you really just want to be playing the consistent win against those as opposed to anything else. And Hela, I get it's weird to be like, oh, Hela's a little bit more consistent, but like, you're seeing most of your deck and your combo is one card. And this, not so much, right? Like this, not so much, a little bit more intricate. It's still good in those matchups, but I think generally Hela is a little bit better into the Loki stuff, whereas Phoenix Force is a little bit better into the Annihilus stuff. If I had to pick one now, I'd probably pick PF, but it's also a little bit more my speed, right? So I think if you want to play a combo deck, these are your two real options. The other ones have been sort of forced to concede that they cannot keep up with a metagame where people are playing Debris, where people are playing Professor X. They're not built for that. These are the decks that can at least try to compete with Annihilus decks, with Professor X decks. They might not be able to do it that well, but they can try, and I think that's enough for them to remain in the metagame. I have a very limited amount of respect for Mill. I am just generally, it feels like every time I play against a deck like this, what is happening is either they are playing Darkhawk, they Darkhawk me and I die, or they are playing Darkhawk and they Darkhawk me and I win. And if they're not playing Darkhawk, it feels like what happens is we play the most annoying game of Marvel Snap of all time, and then I win. Like, that is sort of how I feel about a lot of the Mill decks, where it's like, what is happening here is they're sort of diverging into two camps. One is like Magic Doc, and the other one is using the Cannonball stuff. Obviously, I'm me. I prefer the one with Cannonball Profex, because that's kind of busted, right? I don't want to be doing like weird Doc magic type things. That's not my bag. I feel like it makes you way more vulnerable to all the counterplay in the world right now. Whereas at least this, some of the time you're just doing stats into Cannonball Profex. You got some free wins in there. That really does matter, I think. And as far as the Doc stuff goes, like it really is just Doc and pray. And I have never felt like that's a really good strategy. It reminds me of old Galactus, where it's like, haha, I have successfully executed my plan. And then they leave for 2 cubes. And you're like, oh, great. Now I got to lose like 8 more games before I get a Doc that doesn't kill me. And it's like, yeah, it's not really my bag. I know people play it. And if you're one of those people, I don't want to sit here and be like, your deck is terrible. I will say, though, if you are playing one card, please stop playing that card. That card is Yondu. Don't play Yondu. I promise you can do better. Take him out for like most cards and your deck will probably get better. That said, I think this might just be like a sort of consequence of me being fairly practiced against the Mill deck, right? Like I have a lot of experience playing against this kind of stuff. I have less respect for it because I know what it's doing. And if you don't know what you're doing against this deck, you probably will get run over. But once you start to figure it out, it's like a little bit easier to beat. This deck, mostly pioneered by Gnome, shout out to Gnome, is like an attempt at playing a fair Angela Hope kind of package that doesn't completely eat it to Loki. And I think that's worth investigating. The numbers on it are good. His success rate with it is good. However, the issue it has is just sort of a general, I guess I would call it a lack of cohesiveness almost, where very much what this looks like and what it plays like is you put 3 different packages of good cards in the same deck, and they don't all go together as well as you would like. There are turns when you float energy, there are turns when you are sad. However, and this is important, when they do all go together, you are absolutely popping off. When you do the thing that this deck wants to do, you are playing the best cards in the entire game consistently. You are absolutely going berserk with stuff like this. It does help, but it is like a deck that, for what it looks like as a mid-range deck, it actually has a surprising amount of highs and lows in it. For a deck that looks like it should be consistent, I will not say that it is, relative to the other decks in its cohort in terms of consistency. Like, there are, when you compare this to, say, something like Noki, right? There are way more good 2s in a deck like that you're just happy to play early. In this deck, there is Angela. You are happy to play Angela early. That's it. And if you don't have Angela early, your turn 2 kind of sucks. And that kind of stuff is like, it's a little bit more fragile than it may look for a deck composed of good cards. Similarly, you play Sentry, you gotta beast that, I guess, if you don't have a Nihilus, and that's a weird thing you gotta set up for. Like, there's just kind of a lot going on here, and so when it hits like a truck, and when it doesn't hit, it sort of just feels a little bit anemic. The Token Death Annihilus deck was popularized by KX4N, and has maintained a solid win rate in top 10% Infinite. I still see it a decent amount of the time. But one thing that it has sort of run into is, as the metagame has adjusted to Loki, a lot more Mobiuses have started being played. And if you are a deck built around Mockingbird and Death, you are in a pretty bad spot unless you Lady Deathstrike that Mobius. This is a long way of saying, you gotta Lady Deathstrike that Mobius or you're gonna die to every deck running it. That's pretty much what's going on here. This is the deck that is 100% built for that combo. Mockingbird, Death, we have an Annihilus package in here. Good things happen here, but we are built for that. And if we aren't getting that, we are going to get run over. So that Lady Deathstrike is probably at its apex importance in this list. This is actually a list I would not play right now without Lady Deathstrike. Honorable mention just goes to like the baseline Pixie deck, which is 100% fine. Obviously, I prefer the Mockingbird variant of it, but you know, I'm not going to be like, you gotta play that. This is a totally fine thing to play. I'm not even going to spend a lot of time on it because it has a fairly similar matchup spread as the one with like the other one that we already showed, but losing Profx Cannonball does make you significantly worse in a decks like Hela, in a decks like Phoenix Force, significantly more reliant on your disruption in the form of Spider Ham and Iceman, and of course significantly more reliant on just some surprise bullshit out of a Pixie draw. That is kind of how you're going to have to combat those decks, and not having those options for Profx Cannonball does mean that you lose a bit in terms of your Hela matchup, in terms of your Phoenix Force matchup, and it also means you lose some of the free wins that the deck has built in. Second honorable mention goes to the Stefan, I'm remembering to pronounce it correctly, the Stefan Supergiant deck. Now, this is kind of the only deck you can play Supergiant in, so there is that, and I think as people have gotten a little bit more used to its tricks, this deck has lost some significant percentage in terms of the cube rate, because now people are aware how Supergiant and Negasonic work, which for the record, I should let you know, the way that works is if they Supergiant on 4 and then play Negasonic on 6, it will kill the card you have face down. And that also sort of works the same way with Cosmo, because the cards they play on turn 6 will flip up before the cards under Supergiant. That is a lot of how this deck gets value. The other part of how this deck gets value is Annihilus in the face down. Then you go like final turn Sentry. Completely unexpected. Suddenly it's 20 power out of the Annihilus. Finally, this deck uses Supergiant in order to keep its Ronin safe from getting countered by something like Shang-Chi or Enchantress. Those are the main use cases in the list, and you should be aware of those when you are playing both it and playing against it. An honorable mention is going to Patriot Ball. It has been sweeping the meta in the top end of Infinite right now. I know that at least 3 players in the top 20 are playing this. Yo Woody, Tanjo, and Gnome were all playing it. I believe it was cooked up by Yo Woody. And I think I understand what this deck is about, basically, because what it's trying to do, as I understand it, is sort of be a bigger deck than the small Mobius decks in the metagame right now. That is the idea, I think, behind this that strikes me as like a plausible thing to do. There's a lot of small Mobius decks in the metagame right now, like Noki or even Loki, and what this deck is trying to do is just be a little bit bigger than that, be a little bit unprofitable to deal with, and be generally impossible to Professor X. While you are doing things like Brood Absorbing Man, you simply cannot be Professor X. It cannot happen. And so this is sort of positioning itself in a way to try to combat the first two things on this tier list. That's a totally valid thing to do. It also has Iron Man in here, which exists, I suspect, in order to combat decks like Hela and Phoenix Force. Without it, you simply will not go tall enough. And that's pretty much the deck. You've played decks like this before. They just have Cannonball now, which is good. Don't get me wrong. Cannonball's great, but like you've probably played this deck before. Finally, this list constructed by SafetyBlade is a fairly powerful attempt at fusing the Angela stuff with the Cannonball Profex stuff. I believe I actually covered it last week, describing it in much the same terms. I personally believe that this is a very good list. I genuinely do believe that. I also believe there's a lot of room for experimentation. What if we tried to fuse this with Noki? Does that take us anywhere? I don't really know. What if we got some US agent stuff going in here? Does that take us anywhere? Again, I don't really know. But I think of all of the lists on here, this is the one where I feel like there's the most work to be done, the most optimization to be found. And I think this list baseline is genuinely already pretty strong. It's doing two strong things at the same time, and they don't clunk against each other nearly as much as some of the other lists in this tier list do. I think there is something to be said for this list, and there definitely is some experimentation that should be done with it. All right, y'all, thank you so much for watching, making it through that video. As always, I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal. It has been a pleasure. And of course, please do remember to like and subscribe if you made it this far in the video. I really appreciate when people do that. It makes me feel good. So please do that. Make me feel good. Thank you so much. I've been KMBest, and I will see you in the next one.